Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about what I read in July of 2018. The first book that I finished in July was my pick off of my Classics TBR for the month that I buddy read with Britta, and that was The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. It is said that this book is the very first detective novel. Britta and I found that a little bit suspect. No pun intended. It is likely that this book is not the very first detective novel, and if it is, it's just the first one in the Western world. But what I feel a little bit more comfortable claiming is that this is the first well-known detective novel before it was an established genre. Although it is hard to believe that anything predated Sherlock Holmes. Anyway, on to what this book is actually about. This book centers on a scandal surrounding the disappearance of a very valuable and very famous diamond called the Moonstone. The Moonstone has just been inherited by a young girl named Rachel at her birthday party, but she does not own it for more than 24 hours before it vanishes. We don't see this occurrence happen until a little ways into the book, but we know that it has happened because our narrators, who are shifting depending on where in the story they fit in, they tell us so right up front. And each of the narrators also tells us that they have been tasked to give their side of the story. Our narrators are primarily side characters, so we hear from a servant who is obsessed with the novel Robinson Crusoe. We hear from an uppity old Victorian woman who has lost her entire fortune. We hear from a lawyer who is representing Rachel, and we also hear from someone accused of the crime. This made for a very entertaining, very page-turning story since we're never really hearing from the primary characters. We're just seeing things from everybody else's point of view looking in. I do have to admit though, this book tended to drag on. It was a much longer book than it really needed to be, but both Britta and I found it very accomplished because it's a highly satirical novel. Each character is kind of representing a certain type of person in Victorian society. But each of the characters is still fully themselves. They are a character and not just a caricature. And if you're looking at this book as a satire, which both Britta and I did, I found it really progressive in the ideas that it was putting forward. It's hard for me to discuss those without revealing major plot points, but if anyone has read this book and wants to discuss it with me, I would love to do so. This book was nothing like what I was expecting, but in the best possible way. I really recommend it. And speaking of a novel of ideas, the next book that I would like to talk to you about that I finished in July was Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This has been a very big book on BookTube in the few years that I've been in the community, and although I was waiting for the hype to die down around this book, as I do with most hyped books before I want to read them, I did eventually want to pick it up because I sometimes felt like the last person left on BookTube who hadn't read this book yet. This is the story of Ifemelu, a Nigerian woman who at the beginning of the book is living in the United States where she had originally come to study, but then stayed for work and for personal reasons. But when we first meet her, she is considering moving back to Nigeria. She is partly considering returning to Nigeria because her first love, Obinze, has found success, as well as a wife and child in their home country. The majority of this book is both of their stories, how they both got to the places that they are now, leading up to Ifemelu's return to Nigeria and her long-awaited reunion with Obinze. But throughout, there are also a lot of discussions on the politics of Nigeria, both social and governmental, on immigration and the immigrant experience in both the United States and the UK, as well as American views on race. I know a lot of people really love this book, but I have to say that I just failed to connect with it. There are certainly a lot of thought-provoking and eye-opening things in here, and I do think it's really important to regularly hear critique of your own society and culture. But it is a personal preference of mine that a novel of ideas show those ideas through storytelling and not through conversations between characters or the main character's musings in her blog posts. This novel frequently skirted the line of just being a straight-up essay collection on Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's various observations. And while I love a book that makes me think, and this did frequently do so, I could feel that the storytelling and the characters were not her main priority, and so they felt like window dressing. And so I found this book unsuccessful as a novel, which is what it was sold as. But if all those layers were peeled away from it and this was sold as the essay collection that it kind of feels like it wants to be, I feel like I would have enjoyed it more. But when I was building my TBR for July, I must have been in the mood for books set at least partly in Africa, because the next book I finished was City of Saints and Thieves by Natalie C. Anderson. This is a YA thriller set in Kenya. A young girl named Christina has spent the past few years on the streets. She's a member of a gang called the Goondas, and she's been training as a thief. But she's not trying to just get by. No, she's playing the long game, looking to get revenge on the man she's sure killed her mother. A very wealthy, very important businessman who was once her mother's employer and also her mother's lover. Through his business dealings, he's involved with the militias. He's a war profiteer, and Christina aims to expose him in the same way she heard her mother threaten to only hours before she was found murdered. We start this novel in the throes of it. Christina is ready to execute her plan by breaking into this man's house and stealing his business records, which is the same house that she and her mother lived in when she was a child. Things go awry, but not in the way that you expect, and the deeper Christina gets into this mystery, the less she understands about her mother or what happened to her. This book was fantastic. It is heart-pounding, it is intense, and it is rawly human. The author of this book is extremely knowledgeable about the region, having worked at various NGOs in the area for more than a decade, and so she weaves real occurrences and places into the story in a way that makes everyone and everything in this book absolutely leap off the page. This book was the antidote to all of the frustration that I've been feeling about the YA that I have been reading recently. Highly, highly recommend this one. Another fantastic book that I finished in July was Feathers, The Evolution of a Natural Miracle by Thor Hansen, which was my random pick off of my TBR for the month. This is the natural as well as the cultural history of the feather, something so ubiquitous in all of our lives that we lose perspective on how much of a miracle it actually is. This book starts off by looking at how and when the feather likely evolved, specifically by looking at the fossil record and seeing when they may have first appeared on dinosaurs. From there, we look at the function of feathers, how they keep birds both warm and dry, how they allow for flight, or more importantly, sustained flight, and how they help in attracting a mate. But then, the author steps back into our human realm and explores our relationship with feathers, our use of them in bedding, but also in fashion, and our attempts to mimic them for a myriad of different purposes, including making things waterproof or reducing fuel costs on aircraft. This book will help you understand how remarkable feathers really are. I just love books like this because they always leave me standing mouth agape in awe of the wonder of nature. And Thor Hansen could not have written this book any more perfectly. He makes it so interesting. He cushions the already really interesting science with stories from history or his own personal anecdotes. It's funny, smart, and so much fun to read. I really encourage you to pick it up if you like natural history. And also, Thor Hansen just recently released another natural history book on bees, and that one is now at the top of my TBR. But on a much less fun note, I did end up DNFing one book this month, and I would like to tell you about it. That book was The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love by Oscar Huelos. This was a buddy read with Stephanie over at That's What She Read. This book was so disappointing, if only because the intro was so fantastic. This book starts off with a young boy watching late night reruns with his drunk uncle in the next room when what should come on TV but that specific episode of I Love Lucy that his late father, as well as his now drunk uncle, appear singing a mambo song. The boy then attempts to drag his very intoxicated uncle in front of the TV, but ends up watching it alone anyway. Thrilled to see his father on the screen since he was so young when his father died and he's having trouble remembering his face. But then the story backs up to tell the story of these two Cuban brothers, musicians, who make their way to New York City and end up finding success in the mambo scene. This sounds like a setup for a sexy, spicy novel, but it wasn't. I mean, it's sexual in the same way that sex ed class is sexual, but constantly reading about sex doesn't make something sexy. And so much of this book is the author telling you what happened instead of showing you. You don't get to see these brothers making a name for themselves. You're told. Well, the brothers played this club with these guys and they released this album with this cover art with these tracks, and then hand to God, it just lists the tracks. It alternated between feeling like I was reading a Wikipedia article And then, like, I was sitting next to a completely slosh dude at the bar who just wants to tell you about the good old days and how he slept with just about every girl in the city. Gross and boring. And then to finish off this wrap-up video, I would like to tell you about the two books that I have previously discussed in another video. The first of those is The Mother Tongue, English and How It Got That Way by Bill Bryson. This is an exploration of language in general that eventually goes into the weird development and structure of the English language. It ended up being a very entertaining, although very example-heavy read. And I also read What the F? What Swearing Reveals About Our Language, Our Brains, and Ourselves by Benjamin K. Bergen. This is a book about the science of swearing, its classifications, its place in the brain, its grammar, and its structure. It made for an intriguing reading experience, but one in which someone was swearing at you for a prolonged period of time. I talked at length about both of these books in a dual nonfiction review that I did recently. I will link that for you down below if you'd like to hear more about one or both of these books. So those were all the books that I finished in July. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books, if you've heard about them, or if you're now interested in reading them after hearing me talk about them. You can let me know those things down in the comment section below, or if you'd like to chat with me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media. The links to all of my profiles are linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!